on to the last and final spot. Again, looking at the map, there's really only one thing that really stands out, and it looks like you've got a couple of ponds here. So that's what I had keyed in on my, my interest of the area, the fact that there was a significant water source there. The next part I noticed is that on the pond to the north, there's a little tiny peninsula that comes out and a point that comes out to the from the north as well. And it looks like it could be potential for a water crossing, or an area where there's deer could utilize that to be able to cross between the ponds without having to go all the way around. The next spot, or next thing I'm really looking at, is how those contour lines on the map focal that deer movement as well. So looking at the map, on the west side there's a significant ridge and a plateau, and down through that peninsula you can see there's a gradual decline down towards where the pond is. And then on the on the east to north side of the pond, there again it gains elevation, but certainly not nearly as steep as on the west side. And then to the south, there is another pond where a trail kind of cuts through in between the two. Same thing, west side of the pond, a higher elevation. And then on the east side, more subtle, drop in the terrain. So again, got a focal point, got a good water source. Terrain seems to could potentially funnel movement. Time to get boots on ground. And within the area, lots and lots of deer sign. No surprise, down through this peninsula, multiple trails where there's rubs that are clearly traveling north and south. Come up to that point in between the two peninsulas. Clearly a couple areas where deer are using that as a water crossing. Essentially on this pond area, the little strip that's to the east is kind of a floating marsh. It looks like it's all grass, but if you walk on it, you're gonna get your feet wet. You're gonna feel the squishy water underneath it, and there's a little tiny, like 8-inch wide little creek that runs through there, draining into the larger pond area to the west. Looking for the further north, basically scouting around the pond, lots of deer trails that again travel around all around basically the pond really. So a lot of them are traveling north and south along the outside edges of the pond. On the west side, you've got two main trails. You got one lower next to the pond, and then one about halfway up on a little bit of a transition, or a little bit of a bench area where you're still not on the peak of the hill yet, but you've got basically a flat area where the slope of the hill kind of levels off a little bit and then proceeds to go up the rest of the hill. Again, a main trail that runs off of that, basically that side hill technique that I've seen deer utilize before. And then further to the north, again, as you follow those terrain features that just follow those contour lines, the deer are moving to the north as well. And then there is another main road to the north as well. Through here, a lot of mature timber, a lot of pine, mature maples, basically a lot of this open timber further to the north there. Again, same thing, set up a camera on this water crossing, knowing that that's a bit of a focal point for the movement. It's not necessarily where I saw the vast majority of the deer sign, but just knowing that that could be a pinch point area or an area of interest when it came to potentially ambushing a deer or setting up a hunting spot. Ultimately, there was no real good trees to be able to set up for like a tree stand location, or you could hunt from the ground from that within that little peninsula area. The hard part is setting up an area where you've got a good enough vantage point where you can still shoot, because there is some undergrowth around the edges of those ponds that if you're sitting down and whatnot, you may not get a clear shot at the vitals for the deer. So looking at the spot, kind of pinpointing an area off to the east on the opposite side of that small strip of the pond, looking at that looking at that pinch point or that crossing area, ultimately that's about 70 to 80 yards across. So again, not necessarily good for bow range, but if you were to hunt this spot, or if I were to consider hunting this spot for rifle season or even like muzzleloader or something like that, you'd have a nice clear vantage as deer are crossing through here. And again, once the leaves fall off the trees, you could be able to see deer approaching from the north, as well as walking down that peninsula from the south as well. So you could anticipate the deer movement and capitalize on catching them at that crossing. So ran the cameras here for about 2 months though so far. The first get-go, did show promising results where, there was definitely a lot of does that were kind of cruising here. You could actually see them feeding in between those patches there where some of that grass or whatever they're eating was growing in. A nice 2-year-old buck was kind of hanging out there as well, utilizing that. Caught one time where caught in 2 different situations where definitely a mature buck was utilizing that crossing. Unfortunately, it was at night and he didn't dilly-dally and spend much time there. Basically coming from the south, moving to the north, and quickly cross that area. But I did get some, at least a good glimpse of him on the camera. Didn't really have enough to where I could really analyze exactly what the buck or how many points he had or whatnot. But it's definitely a mature buck in that utilized that crossing. Basically, with that intel, it led me to suggest that mature buck wasn't necessarily living in the area, but basically the fact that he came from the south on 2 separate occasions means that he's living further south, which leads to, trying to figure out where he's coming from. Now, I haven't been able to explore that south region just yet, but it is going to be something that will, be on kind of the back burner, throughout the course of the season, as well as, for my spring scouting for next year to try to determine or get maybe a better idea of where he's coming from, if he's coming from the south. Again, just this week, pulled the camera again. Kind of seemed like it was a bit of a dud at this point, where a lot of the pictures were ultimately just false triggers and whatnot. Did get a couple pictures of what looked like a deer, just like the back of it and whatnot. But ultimately, the amount of trail camera footage, basically really slowed down from the last time that I had checked it. So starting to think that maybe this area was a bit of a dud, or at least, not as promising as I initially thought. So after pulling the camera, kind of walked off to the west to try to check the pond, looking, because there's basically a goose that was, squawking over there. So I figured maybe go check it out. Maybe it could be a good potential, pond or whatnot to do some waterfowl hunting or something like that. And I didn't make it more than, 20, 30 yards. Heading towards the pond, bedded right on the edge of the pond, was, I think, that same 2-year-old buck that I caught on the camera before. He jumped out of his bed and ran to the south. So again, it was kind of one of those things like, kind of reassurance that maybe this spot isn't as bad as I initially thought based on the camera intel. So that was a bit of a reminder that the trail cameras don't always tell you the full story. That buck was bedded, within 30, 40 yards of where that camera location was. And, if I'd just gone off the camera, if I hadn't decided to walk over to that pond, it would have looked as if that, that spot was maybe a bust. But again, same thing, kind of that compounding, features that I look for in a spot. So we got not necessarily a true, standout food source. Now, even though along those pond edges, there is a lot of grasses and whatnot, a bunch of other things growing in because of that, good water source there. Big one is the water, and then the terrain that focuses the movement. So you could, certainly could look at up on top of this ridge here above the pond, it's an area that I hadn't explored more yet as well, or utilizing the terrain feature of those peninsulas, funneling deer movement to make it more predictable. Thanks for watching this segment from the MI Hunting Podcast. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you share the show with your friends. If you do want to see more, you can tune into the full episode right here on the podcast playlist. And if you're on the go, you can always listen to the podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms. And I hope to see you on the next one.